Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. For many Americans, the recent Summit of the Americas was their first exposure to the representatives of some of Latin America's newest generation of leaders. There was particular interest taken in three Andean leaders, whose dynamic and sometimes confrontational styles may present a special challenge to American diplomacy. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Evo Morales of Bolivia, and Rafael Correa of Ecuador are drawing upon and recombining different traditions of Latin American democracy in forging their respective strategies for governance. This refashioning of liberal and communal strains of democratic theory is among the most intriguing developments in a region that is often called democracy's laboratory. With our own new young president calling for the revitalization of the hemispheric dialogue, this may be the dawn of an exciting new chapter in inter-American relations. My guest is Carlos de la Torre, Chair of Political Studies and Director of the PhD program in Social Sciences at the Latin American Faculty for Social Sciences in Ecuador. Carlos, welcome.
Thank you, George.
It's a delight to have you here, and what a great, timely conversation. It's no secret to you, Carlos, or to anyone really, that particularly Chavez, but also Morales and Correa, are the subjects of varied views about their politics, both in Latin America and here in this country. Supporters tend to see them as innovators who are using popular empowerment as a way of achieving political goals and popular assemblies and that kinds of thing. But their opponents accuse them of using what are called revolutionary moments as a guise for their darker instincts, if you will. I guess the basic question to start with is this, Carlos. Is it important for us to understand here that there are really several strains of the Latin American democratic tradition to draw on, and that these men may be using different aspects of these in different ways?
Yeah, thanks, George. Let me start with the most common way in which Chavez, Morales, and Correa are portrayed in the media in this country and also in other parts of the world is that they are populist. Yeah. And they use the term populism to dequalify them, to argue that they are demagogues, and they are demagogues who prey on poor people's ignorance. The other way in which they tend to use the word populism is to talk about irrational economic policies that do not take into account fiscal constraints and that they overspend and will end up in high inflation and the country will go bankrupt. I don't think that this is the way in which the word populism should be applied to understand these leaders. I think that what you see among these leaderships is part of a trend that is more general in Latin America, which is a reaction against neoliberal economic policies.
Okay, the Washington Consensus.
What they call the Washington Consensus. I think that this belief in the market, that the market would take care of poverty, that the market would take care of everything, did not work. So it's a rebellion against neoliberal policies, and in a way it's a return to the past in a very interesting way. The idea is that the state has a responsibility toward its citizens, and the responsibility is to provide jobs, to provide security, to provide medicine, to provide social services. Right. So in a way they want to sort of go back to neo-Keynesian economic policies of the 1960s and 70s, to nationalism. That's why to be confrontational to the United States is important, because they consider that the government were subservient before.
That's an excellent insight, Carlos. You know, and let me ask you, if I can take it one step further, does that also mean, or is that the reason why, they seem to emphasize so much the communal form of political activism? It seems to me what they really, the impression I get is they really mobilize public opinion as kind of the base of their use of power, and people act communally much more than perhaps individually in their conception of how to run things.
That's a very interesting point for a debate, and a debate that they have in these Andean nations. Many academics in these nations, and also U.S. academics, argue that indigenous people have a different way of not only of producing economic goods, but of creating communal solidarity and even forms of political rule that are based on the community.
Right.
And so they have argued, for instance, and especially the Bolivians, that the different ways in which indigenous communities rule themselves has to do with the primacy of communal values over individual values. The same has been argued for Ecuador. And the idea is that these communal forms of democracy could be better than liberal representative democracies based on the individual. But here there are a series of ambivalences and problems, right? On the one hand, communal forms of democracy have responded to this idea of accountability. Because the idea is that at the most basic local level, people name delegates of power to higher instances.
Right.
And these delegates can be revocable when they do not fulfill the promise of their community. And in a way that gives a big sense of democracy. But the problem is that it is assumed that everybody in the community is equal. It is assumed that men and women have the same voices in the community.
Yeah.
That there are no class differences there.
Yeah, yeah.
And the thing is that when you talk, you usually, or the voices that are giving more respect are the voices that can articulate a technical or educated language, and those languages comes with formal education.
Excellent. Let me ask you a question. This is wonderful stuff. For example, first of all, you use the word indigenous, and so these communal forms and this use of them really is a drawing upon indigenous traditions, the most ancient traditions.
Yes.
That's very interesting in the first. But then, and this is very important for me to probe, Carlos, with you. In the traditional usage of the communal forms, you said there was an accountability, because the tribes in the first instance could you put someone in a position, but you could monitor them, and you could engage with them as equals on what they were doing and remove them if they could. But when a sophisticated 21st century government makes use of communal forms, they don't recognize that there's a differential in power here, because they have the last word. So, I mean, it's communal only up to a point. Well, because I mean, well, you tell me, is it?
Well, it's communal up to a point, but also within these communities, they assume that communities are made of equal.
Yeah, but they're not anymore.
They are not.
That's the point.
They are not equal anymore.
Yeah.
They have been engaged in. They have been engaged with capitalism for many, many years.
Right.
And even there is a whole idealization of what communities are. They argue that they are ancestral, but many of their practices come from colonial times. And the practices that for me are the most troublesome, such as physical punishment to people who do not follow according to what the community has decided. In Ecuador and in Bolivia, there is whipping. It's a ritualized whipping, but after all, they whip you.
Yeah.
These are forms of punishment that come from haciendas. Hacienda owners, big plantation owners, use those forms of discipline to labor. And nowadays, some indigenous leaders and anthropologists have said that they're autochthonous forms. So I think that one has to be very careful, and one has to disentangle the democratizing aspects of communal forms, also away from the authoritarian traits that they can have.
What's the fate of things like civil rights, individual rights, human rights in circumstances like this? Are they sacrificed? Are they subjugated? Are they suppressed? Is it made more difficult? What is the general?
Well, there are Bolivian academics that say that communal rights have priority over individual rights, and they will even argue that a concern for individual rights and a concern for human rights is a colonial imposition. It's a colonial imposition from the West, which is based on the individual.
Yeah, but even if so, it's a good one, is it not? Or do they argue the virtue or the
I will personally believe that it's a virtue there, and that we have to respect a series of individual rights, of human rights, and also give the right of dissent. If communities are not homogeneous, people should have the right to think in a different way. The thing is that they argue that when you have debates, You can debate for hours, but once a decision is made, you have to follow through the decision, or you are punished.
Right.
And they punish you by monetary funds. I mean, for instance, in Ecuador, when they go to when indigenous people decide to stage an uprising, which is that indigenous community come from the highlands and stop roads that go to the cities. If a family doesn't want to go, they are fine. Water is disconnected, or even sometimes there is a form of physical aggression. But even if there's no physical aggression, there is always this probability that you can be ostracized from the community. And those things are problematic. And also in terms of individual rights, gender issues.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes they say that women have the capacity to make noises, but not to talk. And supposedly men and women are complementary, but we don't buy that. I mean, there is male power in these communities. I think other communities in Latin America is nothing that just applies to indigenous people.
What happens in these? I'm lumping together in a way both all three: Chavez, Morales, Correa, etc. But when I think of the way that these things are conducted, I ask myself, does it mean that the traditional separation of powers, so to speak, or the balance of powers, executive, legislative, judicial, gets murky? They get blurred, they get conflated even, and there's really no division. It all tends to run together and respect perhaps too much the supreme authority. I don't know, Kuti.
Oh yes, I think that there is that big problem with these three governments, and especially with Chavez. The idea is that, I mean, these governments rely and believe on free elections, and they have used free elections to get rid of existing political elites.
Right.
But they have concentrated power in the executive. They have very little patience with an independent judiciary, and they have had, especially nowadays in Ecuador and in Venezuela, these leaders have majority in the Congress that they rename a National Assembly because the word Congress has a bad connotation. So there's no separation of powers, because I think that there is an ingrained idea, and an ingrained idea that you have a community of people who have one will, one interest, and this will and interest can be embodied in these politicians.
That would be wonderful if it were exactly so. And I mean, I'm not necessarily a critic per se, but I appreciate the explanation. I just wonder, societies really almost never work quite that way, because, and you mentioned it earlier, there's always a dissent somewhere. And it strikes me, Carlos, or maybe this is the question, is it hard for that dissent to make itself known? How do you alter or challenge such a system? What role is there for a loyal opposition, if you will? What can they possibly do or achieve?
Well, that's the problem. The problem is that the discourse that is used by these politicians is that you have a fundamental confrontation between the people whose will is embodied in their leader and the enemy of the people, the oligarchy.
Right.
So there is a fundamental struggle between enemies. And when politics is presented as a fundamental struggle between enemies, it is very difficult to talk to your opposition.
Yeah.
And moreover, I think that because of their strategy of accumulating power has been to run permanent elections. And to win an election, you have to present your rival as an enemy that you have to defeat. But when you govern, you do not fight against an enemy. You have somebody with whom you can talk, with whom you can enter into an alliance. So I think that there is all of this pressure that comes from these leaders to polarize society, and the opposition has responded to this polarization in a very dangerous way, especially in Venezuela. In Venezuela, up until recently, the opposition staged a coup d'etat, staged a very costly national strike against Chavez. And you also have very disloyal opposition sectors in Bolivia, in the Amazonian part of Bolivia, in the Media Luna, in the Half Moon. And so the problem is that on the one hand you have leaderships that have a tendency towards authoritarianism, and you have oppositions that are playing on authoritarianism also.
My goodness, I'm so glad you and I are talking about this. This is because it's in the news here all the time, but I've never heard as clear an explanation as the one you are giving me right now, and I appreciate that. And you struck a point here that I think is extremely important. To maintain this kind of governance, it's like a permanent struggle. There has to be a fight going on all the time, and it's against, I guess, domestic elites and then foreign interests, the Americans in particular, or others. But it doesn't strike me as it can ever really achieve compromise. If it achieves compromise, it dies. You know, it sort of has to stay engaged and embattled all the time. So I guess, I mean, what's the predictable end result of something like this? How does a government like this set its goals within this kind of system?
Well, I don't know. In a way, I think that...
First of all, they have to deliver for the people, that's for sure.
See, let me start with that. On the one hand, these governments have delivered to the people. In a way, they have been able to do so because of the high prices of commodities, and especially of oil. Ecuador and Venezuela especially are all dependent nations, and foreign exchange comes from oil. With a high price of oil, you can do a lot to deliver to the people. The type of deliverance of social services and so on has followed clientelistic ways of distribution. And they are good because they have meant a big difference for common people, but at the same time they have been used politically, right? So that's one of the things that they have delivered. The other thing that they have delivered, and I think is very important in these nations, is a sense of sovereignty and nationalism. No, and this is symbolically very important in nations that feel that their nation is, that the nations are weak, that the states have surrounded. But what is interesting to understand, Chavez, Correa, and Morales, is that they believe that they are carrying on a revolution. They use the language of revolution that we thought it was a thing of the past. What they are saying is that we're not carrying a violent revolution. We're carrying a revolution through ballots, not bullets. But the frame of mind is that you have this permanent revolution, so you always have enemies. First enemies was the traditional politicians. After that, it's the independent media. And so they're always fighting against the independent media. Key commentators on national TV, especially because they have the most visibility, but also a few businessmen. They have not attacked all of the business class, but a few businessmen. So the rhetoric is of being in a permanent revolution with all of these conspiratorial enemies. Right? There is a big conspiracy of empire, the U.S. empire, with all of their allies against the revolution. And they even think that they are going to be killed, that they are going to be murdered. That
Well, this sounds so, it takes like going back 30 years or something. I mean, this is some aspects of it straight.
They have rescue figures such as Fidel. I mean, Fidel is a close advisor of Chavez. But if you listen to the speeches of Rafael Correa, for instance, and Rafael Correa has a PhD in economics from the United States. He has a master's degree in economics from the Catholic University in Louvain in Belgium. And he was never a militant of the left. But every time he ends his discourse with the following words, hasta la victoria siempre, to victory forever.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
Which is, which is a cry of the 1960s, which is a cry of Che Guevara in the revolution.
Maybe it's a way of staying young forever. let me ask you this. How does this, very specific questions about each of these three men and the ways in which they may be institutionalizing what you just said. I understand that there's a new constitution, 2009 version, in Bolivia coming out now. Is this the place where Chavez is, or excuse me, Morales is kind of putting it in writing permanently? I mean, how has it changed?
This is a very good question because, see, for them, the idea is not that you only have to get rid of the existing political class. You have to create new institutions from scratch.
Right.
And in order to do that, you recur to a Latin American tradition, constitution writing. So Ecuadorians have had their 20th constitution approved recently. I think that Bolivians are going to the 19th constitution. Venezuelans are not this exaggerated. They have less number of constitutions. But the idea is that you convene a national assembly, which is going to be a space of dialogue where you create a new social pact. And that's what they are doing. That's what they have been doing. The idea is that we're creating a new political institutionality through constitutional assemblies. And the constitutions that they have produced have very important democratizing traits. For instance, they have expanded civil rights, social rights. The Ecuadorian Constitution recognizes the right of nature. Nature has rights, meaning that if nature is destroyed, people can appeal to the constitutional right of nature, so it is taken care of. In Bolivia, for the first time, and this is symbolically very, very important, for the first time in a country that it's in which you have a white minority and an indigenous majority, in which you have indigenous people excluded in all symbolic and economic ways from power. Nowadays, the Bolivian Constitution has accepted indigenous people as equals, not just in terms of their culture, but in terms of the practices that they have, even of their forms of democracy. So I think that there are very interesting institutional aspects of democratization that go in this government. So that's what is so interesting, these cases, because they are profoundly democratizing on the one hand, but they also have tendencies towards authoritarianism on the other.
You know, and that again helps us understand the complexity. It's not a very simple, just a very simple thing going on. We have to understand the way these things interrelate. And I must say, anthropologically, to me, I find it actually quite exciting that indigenous forms are being looked to, because for centuries they were held in disdain, really, in many places, and relegated to you know, absolute unimportance in terms of national life. That is interesting. To tell me this about, again, focusing on the leaders as individuals, Hugo Chavez, he's the boogeyman of American politics now, as you know. He's always saying something. Actually, he doesn't really do things so much as says them, and that upsets everyone, and or at least a lot of people. Why does he, in particular, make such a put such an emphasis on the international presence of the three men, of the three countries? Maybe it's because of the oil exporting international situation, I don't know, but he has always seemed to me to be the one who has always projected his politics beyond the region more than the other two.
Well, because of the resources that he has, and some people will say because he doesn't believe only to be a local caudillo or a local leader, but an international figure. Enrique Krause, this Mexican writer, who's a right-winger, but a very intelligent person, he has said that the way in which he argues about this or explains this, that Chavez believes that he's the reincarnation of Bolivar, the liberator of Latin America, that at some point there was always an empty chair and Bolivar was supposed to be seated there, giving advices to Chavez. So but apart from that, I think that there is also a very important emphasis on South-South relations, of trying to create this solidarity within Latin American nations. And sometimes it is very rhetorical, but sometimes it can be also very interesting in the sense of creating more solidarity among all of them. But see, it's not just the only form of solidarity, the one that Chavez is promoting. We have to remember that there is a whole turn to the left in Latin America. I mean, many nations, leaders such as Lula, the president of Chile, Uruguay, etc., they are following leftist governments, but without all of this confrontational rhetoric. Because I think that they have stronger, solid institutions. They want to transform society through institutional paths, whereas these three leaders that we have been talking about, they believe that they have to destroy the institutions that existed from before and start from scratch the creation of a revolutionary society.
Because there is this continent-wide turn to leftism, I completely agree with you. I'm wondering, and because we have talked about the influence of the past and the resurrection of past forms and past styles and the influence of Fidel and so forth, I can't resist the question of what is the influence of Marxism in all of this? Is it a nostalgic force? Is it a force at all? Is it just something people quote? Or is it still exists and is trying to co-opt, if you will, some of this?
See, I think that the Latin American left, the Latin American Marxist left, has, especially in the southern cone and in Brazil, they valued liberal democracy. They valued liberal democracy because they were killed by a dictatorship. They were disappeared by a dictatorship, and then they went to exile to the former Soviet Union. So those leftist academics started to say that liberal democracy is not just formal bourgeois democracy that has to be replaced by a revolutionary real democracy, as old Marx has predicted. But interestingly enough, the left in Venezuela, Ecuador and in Bolivia is not a left that has valued liberal democracy. First of all, these three nations didn't experience the type of authoritarian, bureaucratic regimes that the others had. On the contrary, I mean, in some nations, such as in Ecuador, the military did agrarian reform and major distribution policies. So it's a left that has not really accepted and taken seriously liberal democracy. And so, for instance, Rafael Correa, Ecuador's president, who has a PhD in the United States, he makes a distinction between formal democracy, which for him is trash, and real democracy, that it's democracy. Real democracy for him means social equality, social justice. And he went to Cuba recently and claimed that Fidel is a true Democrat and that there are human rights in Cuba. Nobody will say that. I mean, if you believe in freedoms, in human rights and in freedoms, you cannot say that. Really? So there is a whole disdain in this left. I mean, it's a very old left in a way.
When you mention that old left and that trend of thinking, which reflects the old left, and the character of these three men, and you mentioned earlier Lula, and I suppose we could also talk about Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner and Bachelet in Cuba. I mean, I'm just wondering, are these three men with the similarities they have in their governance, are they odd men out in Latin America, or are they? How do you speculate on their relationship with their peers? Well, and we only have maybe one quick answer on that. This one.
I think that there is a solidarity among many Latin American leaders, and I think that people do not accept. Not everybody wants to be totally closely affiliated with Chavez, but Chavez has the support of many young people all over Latin America.
This is something we better not forget. Carlos, I've enjoyed this so much. I want you to come back, and we can keep this conversation going, because it's the best insight in Latin America I've had in a long time.
Thank you so much for having me here.
It's been my pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching this week. Carlos, thank you. That was marvelous. It really was.